If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. When the channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, I'll share a surprise story I prepared especially for you. The provincial outpost stood at the edge of Rome's northern frontier, a line of stone and wood that separated the empire from the unsettled lands beyond. The walls were plain but solid, built to endure attacks and harsh winters, and inside the compound everything had a rigid order: barracks, armory, and the commander's quarters. Soldiers moved about with worn discipline, their armor dulled from years of service rather than polished for show. Late in the afternoon, a merchant led a young woman through the gates. She was small, her shoulders thin, her hair unwashed and hanging forward to cover her face. The marks of captivity were visible, scars across her wrists, a limp that suggested an old injury. She had been brought from another province, taken during a raid, sold and resold until her price lowered enough for her to be purchased cheaply by the garrison. The soldiers at the gate made their usual remarks, jokes that mixed cruelty with boredom. She kept her head down and said nothing. The officer in charge received the paperwork, barely looking at her, then handed her over to a man standing at the side. "Guard her. Keep her useful. That's all." The man who stepped forward was Marcus Vero, a legionary who had served more than 15 years under different banners. He had fought in campaigns across the Rhine and in uprisings within the provinces, and though he had survived, he carried little pride in it. His left cheek bore a pale scar from a sword strike, his right shoulder pulled slightly forward from an old injury. His reputation in the camp was clear: a soldier who obeyed, rarely spoke, and avoided the drinking halls where others drowned their weariness. His function now was simple: hold the line, keep order, and follow commands until his years of service ran out. When he took hold of the rope around the girl's wrists, he did not pull roughly. He looked at her once, his expression unreadable, and turned toward the barracks. She followed in silence, her steps small, each one measured as though she expected punishment if she walked too quickly or too slowly. Inside the long, stone-walled barrack, the air smelled of sweat, leather, and smoke from the central fire. Rows of soldiers' gear lined the walls. He led her to the far corner, away from the others, where a straw mat lay rolled against the wall and a clay bowl of water rested on a stool. "This is yours," he said quietly. His voice was steady, low, without sharpness. She froze, startled by the fact that he spoke at all, then lowered herself to the mat. Her hands shook slightly as she reached for the water, though she did not drink immediately. Years of being treated as an object made her suspicious of even the smallest offering. Marcus sat on his own cot across from her, loosening the straps of his armor. He did not look at her again, nor did he press her to respond. For him, she was another task given by his superiors. Yet in his chest there was a faint heaviness, one he had felt many times before when faced with those who carried the consequences of Rome's wars. He remembered villages burned, families scattered, and the silence of the defeated. It was not pity. He had been trained to avoid that. But it was recognition. The girl, whose name he had not asked and had not been told, curled onto the mat with her knees drawn up. She was exhausted, her body stiff with fear that any sudden noise might mean a command, a blow, or another journey. Her thoughts circled the same point: survive, wait, and see if this man would be cruel or indifferent. When the fire popped loudly, she flinched, then noticed he had glanced at her but said nothing. His lack of reaction confused her more than any insult would have. That night, the barrack grew quiet as soldiers returned to their beds. The murmur of distant voices faded until only the sound of the fire remained. Marcus lay on his cot, staring at the ceiling beams, his mind restless though his body longed for sleep. He thought of the order given: guard her, keep her useful, and wondered what that truly meant in practice. He knew the cruelty of some men in the camp. He also knew he would not allow it, not while she was placed in his charge. It was not loyalty to her. It was loyalty to his own sense of control over a life filled with blood and orders. On the mat, the girl closed her eyes but did not sleep. Every sound kept her awake, her chest tight with uncertainty. Yet she noticed something she had not expected: The man who guarded her did not speak to the others about her, did not mock, did not stare. His silence was heavy, but it carried no insult. That silence, more than any word, became her first fragile reason to endure another day in this place. At dawn, the trumpet sounded across the outpost, and the barracks stirred with the clatter of armor and the shuffle of boots on stone. Marcus rose from his cot without looking at the girl. He strapped on his belt, checked his short sword, and left for the morning watch at the gate. The girl sat still on her mat, unsure if she was meant to follow. No one had explained her place in the camp. Fear pressed in on her chest. What if she failed to do something expected of her? What if silence was seen as defiance? For a long time, she remained frozen, waiting for orders that never came. When Marcus returned at midday, he carried a wooden tray with 2 rations of bread and a strip of salted meat. He set it on the table between his cot and her mat, tore his portion in half, and began to eat. She hesitated, glancing at the food as though it might be snatched away if she reached too quickly. Noticing this, he pushed her half of the bread closer with 2 fingers and spoke quietly, without looking at her. "Eat. It's yours." It was the first time she had been told something belonged to her in many months. Her hand trembled slightly as she lifted the bread, biting carefully, her body bracing for some reprimand. None came. Marcus chewed his food in silence, his gaze fixed on the fire pit, his manner calm. She studied him while she ate. The scar across his cheek, the lines at the corners of his eyes, the way he kept his shoulders square even when seated, as if years of drills had locked his body into habit. The soldiers around them noticed her presence. Some watched openly, their comments crude, but Marcus did not respond. He did not raise his voice or strike them. He only turned his head and fixed his stare on the man who spoke loudest. The soldier shifted uncomfortably and looked away. No one else tried. The girl realized that her guard's silence had weight, stronger than anger, stronger than violence. That night, when the barack emptied into the tavern, Marcus sat sharpening his gladius. The rasp of stone against steel was steady, measured. The girl sat by the fire, clutching the edge of the cloak he had left her. She wanted to ask a question, but did not know if she was allowed. Her voice had grown weak from disuse. Finally, she whispered, barely audible, "Why me?" He did not answer immediately, but his eyes lifted from the blade to meet hers. He seemed to weigh whether she was ready for truth. "They gave you to me," he said simply. "I do as I'm ordered." His words were not cruel, but they gave no comfort either. She lowered her head, but her mind circled with questions. Who had bought her? For what purpose? Was she a servant, a concubine, or merely another piece of property to be used until she broke? She had no answers, only the steadiness of this soldier who treated her with neither kindness nor cruelty, but with a distance she could not yet understand. Later, when the barack dimmed and only the fire remained, Marcus set aside his blade and removed his armor piece by piece. He watched her out of the corner of his eye, how she kept her knees drawn close, how she stared into the flames as if searching for something that had been lost. He remembered the officer's words, "Keep her useful." That could mean a dozen different things. He had seen what other men did with such orders, and his jaw tightened. Quietly, he made his decision. She would not suffer what he had seen before. She would serve in tasks fit for survival, water, mending, fire tending, but nothing more. That line he would not cross. The girl, sensing but not fully knowing his decision, lay back on the mat. She listened to the crackle of fire, to the scrape of his boots as he stretched out on his cot, to the weight of silence that surrounded him. Her body was tense, expecting at any moment that silence to break with a demand. When it did not, when he simply closed his eyes and turned his face to the wall, she allowed herself to breathe a little deeper. For the first time since being brought to the camp, sleep came without the dread of hands waking her in the night. The following days passed in a rhythm that was slow but unfamiliar to the girl. Each morning Marcus left before sunrise, and each evening he returned with supplies or news of patrols. He never explained what her duties were, never ordered her beyond small gestures, pointing to the bucket for water, nodding when she placed firewood by the hearth. It confused her. Slaves she had seen in the past were beaten into obedience or given endless tasks until they collapsed. Here, silence and short words were her only direction. That silence unsettled her, but also gave her space to breathe. One evening, he came back with blood on his forearm, a cut jagged and red. She stared at it, uncertain whether to speak. He set his shield aside and sat on his cot, as if the wound was nothing, but she could not look away. For a long time, she sat frozen, until the memory of other soldiers treating injuries returned to her. Cloth torn, water poured, the smell of iron and blood. Hesitantly, she tore a strip from her own worn dress and approached. Her hands trembled, but she knelt in front of him and pressed the fabric to the wound. Marcus did not move. His eyes remained fixed on the fire, his breathing even. He could have pushed her away or mocked her, but he let her hands work. She felt the strength of his arm under her fingers, the scars that crisscrossed his skin from older battles. Slowly, she tied the cloth around the cut, pulling it tight. When she finished, she sat back quickly, expecting some harsh word. Instead, he simply lifted the arm, looked at her work, and gave a short nod. No thanks, no dismissal, just recognition. That night, when the fire dimmed, he rose without a word and placed his cloak around her shoulders. She stiffened in shock. The fabric smelled of sweat, leather, and smoke, but it was warm. He returned to his cot, lay down, and closed his eyes. For the first time, she felt her body loosen slightly against the mat, no longer curled into itself. She did not sleep quickly, but she no longer trembled. The next morning, the questions that had been silent in her mind grew stronger. Why had he accepted her without asking her name? Did he not care who she was or where she came from? Why had he defended her from the soldiers' remarks when it would have been easier to ignore her? And why, above all, did he choose silence instead of commands? As if sensing her curiosity, Marcus finally spoke more than a few words that evening. While sharpening his blade, he asked in his low, controlled voice, "Do you have a name?" She blinked, startled. Her voice cracked from disuse. "Livia," she whispered. Saying it aloud felt strange, as if the name had belonged to someone else in another life. Marcus set down the whetstone, looked at her once, and gave another short nod. "Livia," he repeated, then returned to his work. That simple exchange gave her a sense of being seen, something she had not felt since her capture. She did not thank him. Gratitude was dangerous when survival was never guaranteed, but in her chest something shifted. He had not asked out of kindness. He had asked as a soldier who wanted to know who sat across from him each night. Yet to her, it was enough. As the fire crackled and the barack quieted, she realized her fear had dulled. She still did not know what the coming days would bring, whether she would be kept here or sent away, but she understood one thing clearly. This legionary was not like the others. His silence was not cruelty. It was a choice, and she decided, in her own silence, that she would watch him as closely as he watched her. Winter settled harshly over the frontier outpost. Snow gathered in uneven piles against the stone walls, and the cold bit through even the thickest wool. Fires burned constantly in the barracks, and yet the air still smelled of damp leather and smoke. For the slaves and servants, this season was often the worst. More punishments, less food, and little warmth. Livia knew it from whispers in the corners, and every morning she braced herself for the moment she might be sent to haul water from the frozen well or clean the filth from the latrines. But Marcus never allowed it. When orders came for her to be assigned to heavier tasks, he intercepted them with a flat tone. "She is already put to use." The commanders, eager to avoid argument with a seasoned soldier, accepted his word. The men in the barack grew louder as the cold deepened, filling the long evenings with gambling and drink. Some eyed Livia openly, their remarks sharper than before. She felt the tension each time a soldier lingered near her corner, waiting for Marcus to leave. But he never left her alone. He remained seated near the fire, sometimes sharpening his sword, sometimes repairing his armor, and always watching. His presence was not gentle. It was heavy, stern, like a wall no one wanted to challenge. The questions Livia carried grew stronger. Why did he bother? Why risk drawing resentment from his own comrades for a girl who meant nothing to the Empire? One night, when the drunken laughter turned into threats directed at another slave, she found herself gripping Marcus's cloak in her hands, her breath tight. She wanted to ask, "Why do you not speak to them? Why do you only stare?" Her voice failed her, but her eyes must have asked enough. Marcus glanced at her, and for the first time, he gave an answer unprompted. "Words change nothing," he said lowly. "But a man who knows what I've done will not test me twice." His words unsettled her. They hinted at something darker in his past, something that explained the silence and the scarred look in his eyes. That night, when the fire dimmed and the others drifted into restless sleep, she found the courage to whisper another question. "What have you done?" Marcus did not answer at once. His jaw tightened, and his gaze fixed on the ceiling beams. Finally, he spoke in the same restrained voice. "I have killed more than I can remember. Men in battle, villagers in raids, rebels, thieves, anyone the orders demanded. Some deserved it. Many did not. The Empire does not ask who is guilty." His tone did not rise, but the weight of the words struck heavier than shouting. Livia lay still, the cloak pulled tight around her shoulders. She could not decide whether to fear him more or to pity him. The next day, she noticed the smallest change. When Marcus returned from duty, he handed her a piece of bread before eating his own. The act was quiet, but deliberate. It was the first time he had placed her needs above his. She accepted it without comment, though her chest felt warmer than the fire could explain. The weeks that followed gave her answers to other questions the audience might ask. Did Marcus have family? He admitted, one night, while cleaning his helmet, that he once had a brother who died on campaign and that no letters came for him because no one remained at home to write. Why had he never tried to rise above his station? Because, he explained, promotion meant commanding men into the same slaughter he despised. He preferred silence and obedience, even if it kept him in the shadows. Livia listened closely, learning that his sorrow was not weakness, but choice. He carried it so others would not. In her own way, she began to return small fragments of herself. She told him she had once been free, the daughter of a farmer outside a provincial town, taken when raiders swept through. She admitted her fear of never again being called by her name until he had spoken it. Each revelation stitched something fragile between them. Not love, not yet, but trust born from survival. And when the commander announced that spring raids were expected beyond the frontier, Marcus looked at her once across the fire, his expression steady but grim, as if to warn her without words. Danger was coming, and their fragile bond would soon be tested. By early spring, the outpost had shifted into its usual state of tension. Scouts returned with reports of unrest in the provinces beyond the frontier, and commanders spoke often of raids and rebel groups. Training drills became harsher, punishments more frequent, and the officers looked for ways to keep discipline tight. One of those ways was the inspection of slaves, counting them, testing their strength, deciding which could remain in the camp and which would be sent to harsher labor. On the morning of the inspection, Livia's chest tightened as soon as she heard the commander's call. She had been spared much of the heavy work because Marcus shielded her, but she knew that made her more vulnerable now. Useless slaves were often sold or cast off. Her eyes dropped to the floor as the others were lined up, their names barked out, their backs and arms examined like animals in a market. The officer's gaze eventually fell on her. He frowned. "This one has little strength. Not fit for field duty." The words struck her like a blow. She felt her throat close. If she were sold again, she would be swallowed back into the cycle of cruelty she had barely survived. Her hands gripped the edge of Marcus's cloak, trying not to tremble, but her knees weakened as the officer motioned for her to step forward. Before she could move, Marcus stepped in front of her. His body, broad and unmoving, blocked the officer's view. His voice, rarely used, came low but steady. "She stays with me." The silence that followed was heavy. The commander narrowed his eyes, and used to being challenged by a soldier known for obedience. "Why?" he demanded. Marcus's stare did not shift. "She keeps the barack in order, fetches water, tends a fire. My responsibility." He said the words like a man declaring a fact, not asking permission. The commander scoffed, ready to argue, but then paused. Marcus Vero was not a recruit. He had years of service, scars from campaigns the officer had never fought, and the respect of soldiers who followed his lead without needing orders. To provoke him over a slave would cause more unrest than it was worth. After a moment, the commander waved his hand in dismissal. Fine, keep her. But if she slows you down, she's gone. Relief washed over Livia so suddenly that she nearly collapsed. She kept her eyes down, hiding the tears that burned at their corners. Marcus did not look at her. His face remained carved in stone. But the fact that he had spoken for her, publicly, in front of the officer in the barrack, left a mark she could not ignore. That evening, when the soldiers finally dispersed, she sat across from him at the fire. The question in her chest would not remain quiet. Why did you do that? She asked softly. He looked at her then, his eyes darker in the firelight. Because I will not hand you back to them. I've seen where they send the others. She searched his face for mockery, for hidden cruelty, but found only weariness. Her heart tightened. For months, she had wondered whether she was safe only by chance, whether at any moment he might change his mind. Now she realized he had chosen to protect her, not out of duty to the Empire, but from his own decision. That night, when she sat beside him, she let her hand brush against his on the table. He did not pull away. His silence still held, but it no longer felt like a wall. It felt like something shared, a place she could breathe without fear. The unanswered questions of the first chapters, whether Marcus would ever break his silence for her, whether she would be cast aside, whether she was only useful as property, were answered in that moment. He had spoken, and in speaking, had bound his fate to hers. For the first time since her capture, she believed she might belong somewhere again. Spring pushed its way into the frontier with longer days and the return of green across the hills beyond the walls. The outpost, once suffocated by the bitter cold, began to breathe again. Yet with spring came new tensions. Patrols rode further, reports of unrest grew sharper, and officers spoke often of moving men to reinforce other provinces. Rumors of reassignment stirred unease in the barracks. For Livia, each rumor pressed a knife of fear into her chest. If Marcus were ordered elsewhere, what would happen to her? Would she be left behind, handed to another soldier with none of his restraint? The question weighed on her, unspoken, every night. Marcus noticed her silence. He was not a man who asked about feelings, yet he could read the way her shoulders stiffened when officers entered, or how her eyes followed him with quiet dread whenever he prepared for duty. One evening, after he set down his shield and placed the rations on the table, he finally broke that silence. "You're afraid I'll be sent away." His voice was low, not accusing, only stating what he saw. She swallowed hard, her hands twisting in her lap. "If you leave, She cannot finish the sentence. Too many memories of chains and open markets crowded her throat. He held her gaze for a long moment before answering. "Then I won't leave you." He said it without hesitation, as if the decision had already been made. "If I'm moved, you come with me. If they sell you, I'll stop it. That is my word." The promise startled her. Roman soldiers rarely gave their word to anyone outside their ranks, much less to a slave. Yet his tone was steady, as if this oath carried the same weight as any sworn in battle. Tears pricked her eyes, but she lowered her head quickly, unwilling to appear weak. Weeks passed, and the commander's orders shifted focus. Raids did not reach the outpost that season. Men grumbled, but the garrison remained in place. Life settled into a routine that, for the first time in years, gave Livia a sense of safety. She gathered water, tended to the fire, repaired simple garments. Marcus continued his duties, returning each night with the same steady silence. The soldiers eventually grew used to her presence and stopped their remarks. She was no longer just another slave passing through. She was known as the quiet girl in Marcus Vero's care. But unanswered questions from the beginning still lingered for both of them. What would her place truly be? Would she remain only as property, dependent on his protection, or could she become something more? One evening, when the fire glowed low and the barack was nearly empty, she dared to ask. Do you see me as theirs or yours? Marcus looked at her steadily, his scar catching the firelight. For a long time, he did not answer. Then he reached across the table, placed his hand gently over hers, and spoke with the same certainty as when he gave his oath. Not theirs, not mine as a thing to own. You are Livia. With me, you stay free of them. Her throat tightened, and for once she did not look away. His words did not erase the scars of her captivity, but they cut through the fear that she had carried since the day she was taken. She felt the weight of chains she no longer wore begin to loosen inside her. That spring night, as the fire burned down to embers, Marcus draped his cloak over her shoulders once more, not as a soldier covering a slave, but as a man giving shelter to someone he had chosen to stand beside. She did not resist. For the first time since her capture, she rested without dread. The story that began with orders and silence ended with a bond neither of them had expected. He, a soldier who had buried comrades and lived with endless loss, found her the first reason to believe life could be more than duty. She, a girl broken by chains and exile, found in him the first place where she could be called by her name and still feel safe. In that barren outpost, against the weight of Rome's wars, they built something the empire itself could not command, a family born not of law, but of choice. And when dawn broke over the walls, they faced it not as guard and slave, but as two people who had chosen to stay together.